As coronavirus cases continue to rise, the White House Coronavirus Task Force is recommending Texas do more to slow the spread. Erica Zucco joining us now live. Erica, did the task force give any specifics for Texas?
Well, Stacia, they did, and it's important to note that this was not a report that was just released out into the public. It was something that was obtained by the Center for Public Integrity, which is an investigative journalism organization, but it did reveal some recommendations that task force had for Texas, specifically saying that it needs stricter measures to try to really mitigate the spread of the disease. Some of those included reducing capacity in both public and private areas, less gathering of people there. They said that masks need to be worn in public at all times, and that people should even be wearing masks with like extended family or vulnerable members of your population if you do have a gathering at home, which of course is discouraged, but we know it's still happening. And they also had recommendations including testing more silent spreaders, potential silent spreaders, talking about those people who are asymptomatic and then spreading it to other people. More testing for group settings. And they said that the PPE supply needs to be tracked really closely because there could be some issues if there's not enough. Now, Governor Abbott has supported measures to increase testing and recently has been talking about really preparing for vaccine distribution. When asked if he would make any of the changes mentioned in that task force report, the Texas Tribune reports a spokesperson said he's relying on data-driven hospitalization metrics, doctors and medical experts to make decisions. He has said in the past that he's reluctant to put any further restrictions on businesses. Reporting in the medical center, Erica Zucco, KENS 5 Eyewitness News.